So today we will continue with study designs. But what we'll be discussing today for the study designs, we'll be discussing just just to build up on some of the issues which we discussed last time. Some of the issues is more of like really adding more flesh and just putting some more issues so that you can understand this study designs more. So it will be more of a repetition and a recap on some of those issues. So these slides, before I proceed, I adopted them from Dick Weber. So Dick Weber is a lecturer at Charity University in Berlin. That's where I got these slides. So I acknowledge his input in terms of developing these slides. So they are not I didn't design the slides, but I adopted from him. So last time we discussed ecological studies, we discussed cross-sectional studies, we discussed case control studies and cohort studies. So just to really look, these are like the common observational studies. Just a summary in terms of certain criteria, which which these studies can you're trying to compare these studies in terms of whether they are suitable to investigate rare disease, whether they are good to investigate rare exposures, examining multiple outcomes, studying multiple exposures, measurement of time, relationship between exposure and outcome, measurement of incidence, and investigation of long latent periods. So in terms of investigating rare diseases, ecological studies and case control studies, they are the best. And in terms of investigating rare exposures, with cohort studies and ecological studies, cohort studies are the best, but ecological studies, they can also do the same job. Remember, if you remember from the previous lecture where we are discussing for case control, we select our study participants based on the outcome, which is the disease. So that's why it is good in terms of investigating rare disease. Then for cohort, we select our outcome based on exposures. So it might not be really correct to then assume we select based on disease or whatever, but in terms of suitability, in examining some of those issues, those things, they tend to tally. Then in terms of examining multiple outcomes, cohort studies are the best. Remember, you might remember in terms of cohort, there's the element of follow-up where you expose your study participants, with something. Then you can follow them up. So one exposure might cause several outcomes. So it's possible to then follow up that. Then in terms of studying multiple exposures, case controls are the best, but cohort studies, they can also do that. Then in terms of measuring time between exposure and outcome, remember we discussed this aspect, which is very, very important. And it's measuring of time between exposure and outcome. This is important. Why? Because of the temporality, the sequence between exposure. Cohorts are the best because for cohorts, you select your things based on exposures. So you can then follow them up to see, you can then follow them up to see, you can then follow, you expose your study participants, then to the exposure. Then you can actually then follow up to see if the outcome or the disease is going to develop. So cohort studies, they are now the best. In terms of measuring diseases, measuring direct incidence of disease, cohorts, they are also the best. Remember, most for cohort, you're following up people. Then as you follow up, you'll be able to see those who develop new diseases or new conditions. So for cohort, they are the best. But for case control studies, I think you see there's a red here. Actually, it means For case control studies, for rare diseases, and for rare diseases, they can also really, they can be good, they can estimate the incidence based on the formula. Then investigation of long latence period, case control are the best. Cohort studies, they can also, long latence, remember, I think we explained this, good for long latence. These are conditions, where, it takes time to develop disease after exposure. You might be exposed to something, but after being exposed to something, it will then take a lot of time for you to develop the disease. So that's the long latence. So case control, they are good for long latence. Why? Because you are already, examining, the cases and the controls, already the outcome there. Cohort studies, they are good. They can do that, but the challenge now is the long follow-up time, because you have to follow up, your study participants or your population for a longer period for you to then see some of those the outcome. So we also have the other type of common and others observational study types, which you might need to be aware of. We have what we call nested case control studies. And it is. So what are these? What are nested case control studies? Case control is a case control design within an existing cohort. So cases from the cohort and unmatched and unaffected controls. So participants, they are similar, automatically matched for the characteristics of the cohort. Less danger of selection bias. So nested case control studies is a bit readable them so that you kind of really understand them. But what is really happening here? We are conducting our case control study in part of an existing cohort. Remember, for cohorts, you start with your exposures. Then as you're starting with your exposures, as you're following up on your study participants, those members of the cohort or patients of the cohort who develop conditions, and that's the outcome. They then became the cases, and then you can match them to the other parts of the cohorts which are not affected. So we are using the same cohort which is being followed up. Those who develop conditions, they become the cases. Then those who do not, they then become the controls. So this one is a good type of design. Why? Because there's less danger of selection bias. Because one of the bigger challenges when you're designing case control studies, the issue of selecting controls is usually a challenge with how do you select them. Because your controls and your cases should be the same, except for the condition which is being investigated. Then we can have what we call a case cohort study. So a case cohort study, this one, all cases within an existing cohort. Then random sample of the whole cohort is what is controls. It's more or less the same with what we were discussing above with the nested case control. So in this one, we are taking all the cases, but in the nested, you might not take all the cases all those who develop the disease. But for a case cohort, you take all the cases within that cohort. Then for your controls, you then do random samples and random sampling of those members of the study participants of the cohort who do not develop the condition. So read about these other study designs so that you can understand them. Then just a recap again on some of these issues with how do we distinguish the individual study participants, how do we distinguish the individual observational studies based on the selection of study participants. For cohort studies, we said you select your study participants according to their exposure status. And so you have got exposed and unexposed groups, which you can then follow up to see whether they develop the outcome. For your case control study, the participants, they are selected by their outcome. And you are selecting cases, those with disease, controls, those without disease, and you look for the exposures retrospectively. Then for the cross-sectional studies, participants are selected irrespective of their outcome or exposure. We are assessing both outcome and exposure at the same time. And these are like the survey. So please, I think this is very important for you to understand. These aspects are very key if you are to understand these study designs. To say cohort studies, selection of study participants is based on exposure status. Case control based on outcome. Cross-sectional studies, the selection is not based on either outcome or exposure, but you are assessing both outcome and exposure at the same year, at the same time. So just a summary of observational studies. Good observational studies can be descriptive or analytic. I hope you remember from what we were discussing when we started the previous lectures. Observational studies have specific strength and specific weaknesses depending on which study which you are talking about. And then longitudinal observations, longitudinal, it means you are following up, and the observational studies are the best to investigate risk or protective factors for disease. Why? Because the element of time, you can see which started the disease origin or the risk factor. Then some observational studies, you choose, there's an opportunity of choosing an appropriate comparison group, which is crucial. Then one observational study can never provide definitive answers. So you need to be careful when interpreting some of the results. So it doesn't mean, yes, we have got we have other observational studies which are good, but some of the observational studies, you know, they have limitations. So you need to be careful so that some of those issues are addressed. Then just a recap again on interventional studies. With interventional studies now, as we explained in the previous lecture, exposure is allocated by the investigator. And with interventional studies, these are also called, these are the experimental studies. The difference between observational and experimental studies is that in experimental studies, the investigator allocates the exposure. But for observational studies, there's no allocation. So most of the interventional studies, they are called trial. I think we've heard this word where we discussed examples of clinical, randomized clinical trial. We have got field trials, we have got community intervention trials. These are epidemiologic experiments which are really used, you know, which are used by epidemiologists to understand some of the things. Clinical trials or randomized clinical trials, RCT, our study participants, remember, as you mentioned, these are most at individual level, and it's where you are randomizing individual. But some of the field and community intervention trials, these ones, you know, the participants are not the patients, but they are the community. And you can actually choose another community where you give another intervention. Then in another community, you don't give them the intervention. So what are the basic principles of designing randomized clinical trials? So you assemble a sample and you assign your intervention. How do you assign your intervention? You assign your intervention by randomization, and you don't just, you have your sample. Then in that sample, the other part of the sample, half of the sample get the intervention. The other sample don't get the intervention. How do you assign the intervention? Through randomization, and then you apply your intervention, you follow up. So most of the RCT or random or experimental, there's the element of follow up. You measure your outcome and the response. Then you compare between the two groups to see if there's a change. There must be always a control group. And a control group does, remember, you applying your intervention. As you assign your intervention, you don't assign to everything. The other part which doesn't get the intervention, that's the control group. And they're always longitudinal. And as I mentioned, you randomize your sample into the intervention group and the non-intervention group. What are the features of randomized clinical trials? As I said, there's randomization, and there is randomization. This one, it really helps to we are going to discuss this in the coming lectures, where we are discussing about confounding. So by randomizing, it means we are distributing the baseline characteristics or the confounders equally between the intervention group and the control G and the control group. Then we have what we call allocation concealment. This one, it helps to reduce selection bias. We have our intervention group, and we have, so the allocation concealment, what can I say? Maybe I didn't describe this. The allocation, remember, you have got your two groups, and you have your two groups. One group which you are giving an intervention, and the other group which you are not, which you are. So you have got the interventional in the control. So by allocation, it means what you are giving, and what you are giving to these arms, and it's not like, what can I say, it's concealed. It's not obvious, and for you to know, which which arm, and it is whether they received the, whether they got the whatever drug you are giving, whether they got a placebo and the drug is the same one. Let's say you're comparing two things. They've got two interventions. Another one is not getting anything. That's the placebo. Whereas the other one, they are getting something. So you can actually conceal, so that it's not very clear for whoever is giving, the intervention or the non-intervention, to know what has been given. So that is the allocation concealment. It really helps to prevent selection bias. Imagine as a doctor, you are giving two interventions, and there's one intervention, another intervention. Maybe after randomization, you know the background of the patient, to say this patient maybe has got severe disease, and you know if they get this treatment, they're likely to do better. And so there's some element of selection bias. Actually, if you know the treatment, actually what will be given. So because of that, if you really know which this contains this, that's allocation bias, selection bias now then comes into play. Then you've got your, as I said, you've got your intervention group. That's where you give whatever intervention you're giving. It can be medication, it can be radiation, it can be surgery. Then you've got your comparison group, or your control group. So it depends, and with whatever you're testing. In some scenarios, you can give them a placebo, which means you don't give them anything. And you don't give them anything. You're just giving, you're comparing something. You're comparing two, and you're giving the other group another drug. Whilst you're comparing one to another, to a drug. So if you don't give anything, that's a placebo. But in most cases, you cannot then say, for this group, I will not give them something. Why? Because I think we discussed in the previous lectures issues to do with ethics, and there are ethics when we are doing randomized control trials. So let's give, for example, these days we have got coronavirus, and we have what? We have coronavirus. We know from studies which have been done. Now we have seen drugs like remdesivir, chloroquine, and prednisolone. They've been shown to work, but there are newer drugs which are being developed. And so you cannot then you have a newer drug which is being developed. You cannot then have a placebo, where you don't give people something and compare to another newer drug which is being developed, maybe interferon or whatever is being developed. You can't do that. You can then have to compare that with a standard therapy. And in this standard therapy, yeah, that's what we then compare it. Because you cannot then, compare, was there something which is already working? So because of that, I think we have discussed a bit of those ethical. Then there's issue of blinding, and there are types of blinding where you're masking. It's more or less the same as concealing, and in terms of the intervention which you are giving. But for blinding, you can have several stages. You can have single blind, double blind, and it is depending whoever is being blinded. I think there are slides where we discuss this. You can also have blinded outcome assessments. Then most of the randomized control trials, they have an element of a plan for how the study should be discontinued. I think we have had, I always refer to the coronavirus pandemic. Could the chloroquine arm has been discontinued? And it's why? Because most of the randomized control trials, they have what we call a data monitoring and safety board, and they do the interim analysis where they'll be analyzing data and it on a regular basis, just to see on a regular basis, to see, to assess the efficacy, to see if the difference, to assess if there are side effects. So if the data monitoring safety board and it just notice any one of any issues, then actually they can actually discontinue. Remember, the discontinue can be in both, can be either positive or negative. By negative, it means this doesn't work, let's stop it. But in some cases, people might say, no, this thing seems to be working. Why do we need to continue doing this, doing this study? Because there is overwhelming evidence, to show that this drug works, so they can actually stop the trial. So those systems, they have to be in place for randomized control trials to make sure if the study can be continued or can be discontinued. This diagram just summarizes the whole process of and it how the gold standard, how does it, and it how, in terms of how an RCT appears. You've got your population, you get your sample, you then have your volunteers. Most of the RCTs, they are, when you're giving a drug, how you select your population, I know these sampling methods, where you sample whatever. But in most cases, it's not like really you randomly select people on it, but I think you have a set of volunteers. And then these volunteers, you then allocate, and they are randomized either into intervention or a control group. But as you randomize, there's also the element of allocation consuming. Whatever you're giving them is not known by the intervention or control gene group. Then there's the element of follow-up, and which is C. Then if you read the C in our slides, you see that what I was explaining to saying, there's the issue of health investigators and external monitoring committees like the data safety and monitoring board, and which can then actually follow up to see what's happening. Then after some time, you look for your outcomes. Why do we randomize? And why are they called randomized? So by randomization, the reasons why we randomized, and statistical theory based on random gene sampling, participants have non-usual and equal chance of being allocated to either an intervention or a control gene group. So that's why we randomize, because if you randomize, by randomization, and based on the principles of statistics, it means each of the participants has an equal chance of being allocated to either an either. There's no bias, and there's no selection bias, because each one of them will have an equal chance of actually going to any one of those. Then there will be equal distribution of confounders. So if the participants have an equal chance of being distributed to either control or what, then there's also an equal chance of there's also an equal distribution of known and unknown confounders. Remember, our confounders, they affect the relationship between exposure and outcome. Then if you also randomize, the allocation cannot be predicted. Is randomization ethical? And is randomization ethical? I think we discussed this. At times it might not be really ethical. And it might not be ethical. It can be ethical or it can be unethical. I think I gave an example. For example, you really know that this patient has a condition, and if this patient don't get this newer drug, they are going to die. So in this case, if you randomize, they might not get or they might get the drug. So because of that, these issues of of ethics really remains an issue. What are some of the prerequisites of conducting a clinical trial? We have what we call equipose, and so equipose is certified if there is a genuine uncertainty within the expert medical community, not necessarily on part of the individual investigator about the preferred treatment. So I think there needs to be some consensus within the expert community, among the experts to say in terms of let's say whatever you want to compare, and there need to be some consensus to really say we really need information actually to really solve whatever issue which you might have, or to really see if the drugs work or it doesn't work. Not necessarily the person who is conducting the study. The person who is conducting the study might, the person who is conducting the study I think that's why I think if you have this concept of conflict of interest, where people are supposed to disclose their conflict of interest, especially in clinical trials. Why? Because there's a lot of unethical things which can happen. People can decide to do a study. Why? Because they are working for a pharmaceutical company, or they are doing this. I think you've heard this whole conspiracy theories. Now, if you go to America, I think you've heard the issue of chloroquine. There's another doctor, that black doctor from Cameroon, and who gave a press conference saying chloroquine works. I gave it to 200, whatever, 350 patients. They all survived. Why? Because then I think you've also Donald Trump also really twitching himself to say chloroquine works, what. And a lot of these theories to say, people, they want to make sure Donald Trump lose the election, no. So there are issues here in terms of really clinical trials where people can push things to the other side. Why? Because they are benefiting. So I think I described this. Is it ethical to withhold a treatment that is known to be beneficial? So usually, that's what I mentioned, to say the control group often gets the standard treatment rather than the placebo. So you cannot, if there is some treatments available, you have to give that standard treatment as opposed to not giving another treatment because of those ethical issues. Then blinding, as you are giving your treatment, so the blinding, it refers to the and it is blinding, it refers to the masking of the treatment delivered. So in a single blind, the study participants, they don't know, and they don't know what they are getting, and they don't know what they're getting, what they are getting. Then in a double blinded, the participants and the people who are giving the treatment, maybe the doctor, they are also blinded. They don't know, and whatever they are giving, they don't know what they are giving to the either to the interventional or the non-interventional. Then what is the triple blinded? The participants, the people who are the investigators, and those who are doing data analysis, they don't know in terms of what we have been given to either to the intervention or to the non-interventional group. But one person will actually know, and the person who designed the study, which is the principal investigator, they know this was this was this. These things can only be revealed later, from the results, and this is where they then see. Yeah. So all these things actually, they are done. Why do they do all this blinding? And why it's done because to minimize ascertainment bias, so that it's all about reducing bias. Then in terms of analysis, these are two words which you need to read and try to understand. They might be complicated for you to understand. When we are analyzing the results of an RC RCT, there are two ways these results can be analyzed. We can do what we call intention to treat or per protocol, and it or per protocol. So intention to treat when analyzing now. Remember, this refers this refers to, what can I say? This refers to, remember, you have got your two groups, and you have your those who get the intervention and those who don't get the intervention. But during the process, remember, and during the process, as you are during the process of follow-up, some patients might stop treatment, some patients might die, some patients might have lost to follow-up, or other patients in some other cities, they might be switched from intervention to they might be switched either from control to intervention or vice versa. So these two ways where I say intention to treat or protocol, it then what can I say? It then depends on how are you going to analyze to analyze your study participants. For intention to treat, analysis includes every subject who is randomized according to randomized treatment assignment, which means if in simple, for intention to treat is once randomized, always analyze. You are analyzed according to where you were assigned. If you are assigned to intervention, when you're analyzing, and in terms of your outcome, you're analyzed under that. If you are assigned to this, and you might change. You might change during the process where you go either, but in terms of your final outcome will be analyzed based on your initial treatment, what assignment. Then for protocol, you are analyzed based on what you actually get. And you can read these things in detail, but just understand these words. They might come, you might hear these words being said to say intention to treat or the protocol, and what is the meaning of these words. What are the advantages of RCT? They provide evidence that is least likely to be biased. They provide evidence, and they provide evidence that is least likely to be biased. There's equal distribution of known and unknown confounders. There's greater control over the exposure because you assign the exposure to either intervention or not intervention. Then there's need to define clinical importance, and need to define clinical importance. This one is very important. Why? Because a very small, let's say you're doing your RCT, you might find a very small difference, and this small difference which you might find, and it might be of clinical relevance, though it is small. So the interpretation might change, and the interpretation actually, it doesn't really mean you need to have a very huge, a very huge discrepancy. Actually, you might not really see, a meaningful difference, but the element of clinical importance or clinical relevance might alter your results. Then you can also need, by RCTs, you can also quantify the benefit on intervention where you balance the needs and the harm. So there's an element of cost-benefit analysis which also comes into play from RCTs. What are the limitations of RCTs? Issues of ethics, and I think we've discussed that. For practical and ethical reasons, many questions cannot be studied by RCTs. Then at times it is difficult to generalize the results. Why? Because usually for RCTs there's selective enrollment, and in terms of but usually in terms of whatever criteria which will be used. But in real practice, participants, they often differ in terms of age, sex, race, or ethnicity. Then also sometimes treatments are delivered more rigorously in a trial setting. So the way people get drugs or get their treatment during a clinical trial is not the same way people get treatment in real life. In real life, people, the real life, as opposed to, for some of the experiments, these RCTs, people, they are phoned every day. You know, they receive phone calls, they receive, and they get so many other, you know, they get reminders, and they're given the proper drugs, they're given, you know, sorts of things. So actually, you cannot then really generalize some of these findings because the real world is not the same as what happens during clinical trials. Then full benefit of randomization relies on intention to treat analysis, which is its own bias. Remember, we discussed these two: intention to treat NG, intention to treat, and the protocol. So these are different, you know. So, but if you then do the protocol, the randomization effect will not really give the required benefits. They are very expensive and time consuming. Then small size of many trials can lead to imprecise results that might not be. Issue of replicability might also be a challenge. So just to summarize, our interventional studies, exposures are allocated by the investigators. Randomization minimize bias. Thus, randomized clinical trials are optimal design for many research questions. There are disadvantages, and I think I've discussed in terms of how to analyze the data and issues of ethics. Then interpretation of the findings needs to consider the magnitude and precision of the effect, validity and applicability, harms and benefits. So as you interpret your findings, there are so many things which you need to consider. Then this one, I think, is just, you know, a general in terms of how do you conduct, you know, a study, and just for your own benefit. When you're conducting a study, what are the steps which you do? You discuss this in detail when you are discussing how to develop your research proposal for your study. So I think these ones you can also read it. Then one of the things which you need to understand now, after you do, there's what we call hierarchy, and there's what we call hierarchy of studies. With our basic studies, and which we have, you know, your case control, your case series, your case reports, your cross-sectional studies, your observational, your what, and this. So we have what we call a level of evidence, which is generated by these studies. Which usually the least in terms of level of evidence, which is generated by studies, we have your experts. There are things which are said by experts where they comment on things, they give their expert opinion. Then from there, we have got your case reports. Then you have your case series. You have got your cross-sectional studies. You have got your case control. You have got your observational. Then on top, in terms of the single studies, we have your RCTs. But at times, we can move to another higher type of studies, which we call systematic reviews. And what are these systematic reviews? Systematic reviews, their aim is to summarize existing literature on a specific research questions. And so what do? You take a lot of, you then do, let's say it's a topic, I think you've seen this, for example, for chloroquine against COVID. There are several studies which have been done to try to assess the effect of COVID. In a systematic review, you are analyzing and summarizing all those studies, and it to actually come up with some conclusion on whatever issue and which you are looking into. So systematic reviews, they are not like really type a single study, but they are studies which summarizes a lot of other studies. And how do you do this? You search, databases for these studies. You exclude, you exclude the literature which is not relevant. You've got some criteria which studies to include and not to include. Then you summarize data according to predefined categories or characteristics. There are tables and charts which can be used to do this. But for so remember, a systematic review and a meta-analysis. Meta-analysis, it means we are then summarizing the data, and whatever measures which you are using, then that's a meta-analysis. But if you don't include data analysis, you're just summarizing, you're just summarizing the literature without having the element of data. It's called a systematic review. The moment you start also trying to analyze the data, it becomes a meta-analysis. And So a meta-analysis, just to sum it up, there's an element of data analysis. This is an example, and it where you've got several studies which have been done. Each study they found, they have its measurements, whatever you're measuring, we have got its measure, whatever this study, this study, this study, this study. In a meta-analysis, you then pull 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 studies, and you get one estimate for whatever you're assessing. So the same with this and with this. So this is a meta-analysis. Then there's concept of publication bias, and usually when you're doing a meta-analysis or a semantic review, you need to assess for publication bias. In most cases, in some cases, usually studies and other studies they are published, while others are not published. So if you only consider studies which are published, this might lead to misinterpretations or overestimation. And so that's why in most cases, when you're doing a meta-analysis or a semantic review, you need to include both studies which are published and those which are not published, because there are several reasons why some studies are not published. And other people might not decide to publish other studies because of other several issues. Then just to conclude this whole topic in terms of study designs, where we started, these are like the final words. With epidemiologic studies can be classified as descriptive or analytic. They can be longitudinal in terms of follow-up, and there's a longitudinal, which means there's an element of follow-up or not. If there's not, those are cross-sectional studies. They can be observational or experimental. Each study design has its place, and you choose it depending on depending on your research question, on whatever problem you want to observe. Longitudinal studies, where you have an element of follow-up, they are the best if you want to look for risk factors, because you can assess temporality, relationship between time and exposure. Then RCTs, they are very good, and they are the gold standard in terms of establishing causality. And you want to see causality in whatever, and in terms of level of evidence, cause and effect. Then systematic reviews and meta-analysis, these ones now, they provide aggregated measures of individual studies. And you are combining several studies. Systematic reviews, a systematic review, you are just summarizing findings and the narrative. And then meta-analysis, there's an element of data analysis. So you are providing aggregated measures of individual studies to overcome issues of limited sample size or controversial findings. Remember, there's a balance, and we discussed about publication bias, where you can have studies which are not, which are negative, not being published. Otherwise, I think this is the end for our lecture on study designs, where we are adding actually more, information. Some of the issues we discussed them in the first lecture, but I thought I needed to add more issues for you to